Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Crimson Ether. I know many of you like to listen to these episodes as you drift off to sleep. Before you settle in, feel free to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from around the world. And if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. What police found in this abandoned cabin changed everything. There are certain places in this world that feel like they belong to something much older than the human race. In the winter of 2012, a seasoned land surveyor named Silas Thorne found one of those specific places. Silas was a 34-year-old professional who was tasked with marking boundaries for a new conservation project today. He spent most of his lonely days navigating through the thick brush and the heavy timber of the mountain range. The air was incredibly cold that morning, and the ground was covered in a layer of crisp and white frost. He carried a heavy pack filled with surveying equipment and a thermos of black coffee to stay warm today. The local maps indicated that this specific area was entirely uninhabited and had been for at least 75 years. Silas noticed that the trees in this section of the woods were unusually tall and they blocked out the sun. He felt a strange sense of unease as he realized the usual sounds of the forest had gone completely silent. The surveyor checked his handheld navigation device and realized he had drifted nearly 3 miles away from the access road. He looked through a clearing in the trees and spotted a small structure that was not on any official maps. It was a cabin made of dark cedar logs, and the roof was covered in a very thick green moss. The windows were clouded with decades of dust, and the heavy wooden door was standing slightly open in the wind. Silas knew he should stay on task, but his curiosity about the abandoned structure began to outweigh his professional logic. He approached the small porch and noticed that the floorboards did not creak at all under his heavy leather boots. The air near the cabin smelled like old cedar and something sweet like a basket of very overripe summer peaches. He pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside to find a room that was frozen in a perfect silence. The interior of the cabin was remarkably clean, which was strange considering the structure looked like it was very old. He saw a set of rusted iron cookware hanging from the wall and a single wooden chair near the table. A layer of fine dust coated every surface, but there were no cobwebs hanging from the dark and heavy rafters. Silas walked further into the living area and saw a collection of old leather journals stacked on a side table. He reached out to touch the top book, but stopped when he heard a faint scratching sound from the floor. It sounded like something large was moving beneath the floorboards, and the sound was rhythmic, like a slow, heavy breath. He stood perfectly still while his heart hammered against his ribs, and he gripped the handle of his heavy flashlight. The scratching stopped suddenly, and the cabin returned to its oppressive silence while the shadows grew longer across the floor. Silas decided to investigate the source of the noise because he believed a mountain lion might be nesting underneath him. He found a heavy iron ring set into a wooden hatch in the corner of the small and dusty kitchen. The surveyor pulled the hatch open, and a rush of freezing air hit his face from the darkness below him. He clicked on his high-powered flashlight and began to descend the narrow wooden stairs into the cramped cellar space. The walls of the cellar were made of rough stone, and the floor was nothing but very hard-packed dirt. He moved the beam of light around the room and saw shelves lined with hundreds of glass mason jars today. Many of the jars were filled with murky liquids and small personal objects that Silas could not immediately identify. He moved closer to the back wall and noticed a heavy wool curtain hanging over a small and arched doorway. Silas pulled the curtain aside, and what he saw on the other side made his blood turn into cold ice. The hidden room behind the curtain was a perfect replica of his own childhood bedroom from 1988. He recognized the faded blue wallpaper and the specific pattern of the race car sheets on the small twin bed. There was a wooden desk in the corner with a pile of comic books that he used to own. He saw a plastic toy robot sitting on the nightstand that had a distinctive crack across its glass visor today. This was his bedroom from the house where he grew up 3,000 miles away in the state of Maine. Silas felt a wave of intense vertigo as he looked at the posters of astronauts pinned to the wooden walls. He reached out to touch the bedspread and confirmed that the fabric was real and felt exactly like he remembered. There were no windows in this room, and the only light came from the flashlight trembling in his sweaty hand. He noticed a small silver tape recorder sitting in the center of the desk next to a stack of cassettes. Silas felt a strange compulsion to press the play button, and the machine whirred to life with a soft hiss. A voice began to speak through the small speaker, and Silas nearly dropped the recorder when he recognized the tone. It was his mother speaking to him, but her voice sounded exactly as it did when he was 6 today. She was reading a story about a brave knight, and she used the same nicknames she always used for him. Silas listened in horror as the recording continued because he knew his mother had passed away in 1999. The voice on the tape then stopped reading the story and began to describe what Silas was wearing today. It described his orange surveying vest and the brand of the boots he had purchased only 2 months ago today. The voice told him to look under the bed, and Silas felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. Silas dropped the tape recorder and scrambled back toward the stairs while the voice continued to speak from the desk. He did not look under the bed because he was certain that something was waiting for him in the shadows. He climbed out of the cellar and ran through the cabin door without looking back at the dark walls once. The surveyor did not stop running until he reached the logging road and saw the familiar shape of his truck. He drove straight to the nearest county sheriff's office and demanded to speak with the officer on duty that night. Deputy Arlo Vance was a man who had seen many strange things, but he looked concerned by Silas and his story. Silas explained what he had seen and showed the deputy the location on his digital map with a shaking finger. The deputy called for backup, and they headed back into the woods as the sun began to set behind peaks. They reached the coordinates just as the last of the light faded and the forest became a wall of black. The police officers approached the cabin with their weapons drawn and their tactical flashlights cutting through the thick mountain mist. They found the front door standing wide open just as Silas had left it during his frantic and terrified escape. Deputy Vance led the way into the kitchen and found the hatch to the cellar was still pulled wide open. The officers descended into the darkness with Silas waiting near the top of the stairs with a heavy iron poker. They reached the back wall and pulled the wool curtain aside to reveal the hidden room that Silas had described. The room was not a bedroom for a child, but was instead filled with thousands of printed color photographs today. Every single photograph was a candid shot of Silas Thorne taken from various distances over the last 10 years today. There were pictures of him eating lunch at a diner and pictures of him sleeping in his own private apartment. The walls were covered in these images, and they were organized by year and month in a very terrifying display. The police found the silver tape recorder on the desk, but there were no cassette tapes inside the small machine. They also found a collection of journals that contained detailed notes about every person Silas had ever spoken to before. One journal was titled 1999, and it contained a detailed medical history of his mother's final few days. The officers searched the rest of the cellar and found a small crawl space hidden behind one of the shelves. Inside the crawl space, they found a sleeping bag that was still warm to the touch as if recently used. There was a high-powered directional microphone and a set of long-range binoculars sitting neatly on a wooden crate. It became clear that someone had been living in this cabin and following Silas for more than a decade today. The police found a final note pinned to the back of the door that was addressed to Silas Thorne directly. The note said that the experiment was over, and it thanked him for being such a predictable and interesting subject. The investigation lasted for several months, but the authorities never found the person who had built the hidden cabin today. They checked local property records and found that the land was listed as state property with no history of buildings. Forensic teams could not find any usable fingerprints or DNA evidence in the cellar or on the various items. Silas moved across the country 3 weeks later and changed his name to avoid being found by his stalker. He stopped working as a land surveyor and took a job in a high-rise office building in the city. He never goes into the woods anymore, and he keeps his blinds closed even during the bright hours of day. The memory of his mother's voice coming from that silver recorder still haunts him every time he hears a scratch. He knows that someone out there knows everything about his life, and they might still be watching from the shadows. The cabin remains empty in the mountains of Washington because no one wants to go back to that dark ridge. Reports from the local dispatch logs show that no one has set foot near that location in many years now. Some stories are best left in the dark, and some cabins should never be opened by a lonely land surveyor. Silas Thorne still looks over his shoulder every time he enters a room, and he never feels truly alone today. The depth of the psychological trauma stayed with Silas as he tried to rebuild his life in a new state. He constantly checked the locks on his doors and windows at least 4 times before he could try to sleep. The silver tape recorder was kept in police evidence, but the sound of that voice lived forever in his mind. He often wondered how the person managed to record his mother so many years before she had actually passed away. The investigators suggested it might have been a very sophisticated voice synthesis program designed to mimic her specific speech patterns. Silas knew deep down that the voice was too perfect and the subtle inflections were exactly like his mother's real voice. He sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night thinking he can hear the slow scratching sound beneath him. The city noise usually drowns out the imaginary sounds of the forest, but the fear is always present in him. He often thinks about the mason jars filled with liquid and the small personal objects he saw in the cellar. One of those objects was a silver ring that his father had lost during a fishing trip in Maine years ago. Another jar held a small lock of blonde hair that looked exactly like the hair he had as a child. The level of detail required to curate such a collection of personal items was truly beyond any normal human effort. The police eventually closed the case because they had no leads and the cabin was eventually torn down by the state. Silas received a package in the mail 5 years later with no return address and a postmark from a different country. Inside the box was a small plastic toy robot with a distinctive crack across its glass visor and a small note. The note simply said that the subject had successfully adapted to the urban environment and the observation would now continue. Silas dropped the robot and it shattered on the floor while he realized the experiment had never actually truly ended. He looked out his window at the busy city street and wondered which of the thousands of people was watching him. He realized that the cabin in the woods was just one small part of a much larger and darker plan. The surveyor turned off all the lights in his apartment and sat in the dark while he waited for a sound. He did not know who was following him or why they had chosen him for this strange and twisted project. The only thing he knew for sure was that the woods were no longer the only place where he was watched. Every step he took and every person he met was recorded by someone who knew him better than he knew himself. The story of Silas Thorne is a reminder that some secrets are never meant to be uncovered by the curious. The local news in the small mountain town eventually stopped talking about the cabin and the strange findings in the woods. People moved on to other mysteries, and the forest slowly reclaimed the spot where the cedar cabin had once stood. But the dispatch logs from that night still sit in a dusty filing cabinet in the county sheriff's office today. They tell a story of a man who found a piece of his past hidden in a place it never belonged. Silas Thorne is now just a name in a file and a memory to the officers who saw that bedroom. He lives his life in the shadows of the skyscrapers, and he never looks at a cedar tree without a shiver. The world is a much smaller place than we like to think, and the people watching are closer than they seem. Silas Thorne knows that the next time he hears a scratching sound, it will not be a dream from the woods.